This video has been a long time coming for me. I've been on a mission, a holy mandate to prove to the masses that the power we now have on Android handhelds is not just good enough, but genuinely cutting edge. And look, I know PC emulation is reaching critical mass, so now everybody and their grandma is talking about how powerful phones are, but I was doing it before it was cool. Underappreciation aside, today I want to do something very specific. I want to highlight the power of the Retroid Pocket G2 and, more importantly, what's inside, which is the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2. Because there's not been much discussion on the new G series from Qualcomm. These chips have been written off as refreshes under a new brand. And perhaps so, perhaps not. At any rate, I genuinely believe this chip should become the new standard for lower cost but ultra performant dedicated gaming handhelds. And the only way to prove that is to dive right in. Before we even get into performance numbers, it is very important to be clear about what these chips actually are. The Snapdragon G2 Gen 2 does not exist in a vacuum, and the more you look at its core layout, clock targets, and process node, the clearer it becomes that it is derived from and effectively a rebadged or specialized version of the Snapdragon 7 Plus Gen 3. They share the same fundamental DNA, a 4nm process node, and the same 1+4+3 CPU configuration. Where they differ isn't in the raw silicon so much as in the intent behind it. The G2 Gen 2 takes that 7 Plus Gen 3 foundation and strips away the phone first priorities in favor of behavior that makes sense inside of a gaming handheld. On the CPU side, the G2 Gen 2 is built around a prime core running at roughly 2.8 GHz, 4 performance cores running at 2.57 GHz, and 3 efficiency cores running at around 1.9 GHz. It's a balanced configuration that isn't chasing extreme clock speeds, but instead prioritizes stability and predictability over long gaming sessions. That design choice becomes more obvious when you compare it directly to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. On paper, the 8 Gen 2 has the superior CPU, no question about it. Its prime core boosts significantly higher, up into the 3.2 to 3.36 GHz range, depending on the bin, with performance cores pushing closer to 2.8 GHz and higher efficiency core ceilings as well. In pure CPU terms, it offers more raw single-threaded and multi-threaded headroom, and that advantage shows up clearly in workloads that benefit directly from it. You know, your CPU-bound stuff. When it comes to the GPUs, the picture is a little less transparent, largely because Qualcomm no longer publishes detailed topographical data like shader counts or execution layouts. That means we can't break this down at the architectural level in the way we're used to. What we can look at, though, are real-world operating characteristics, and one of the most telling is clock behavior. In practice, the Adreno A22 GPU in the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2 is able to run up to 950 MHz, while the Adreno GPU in the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 simply tops out at around 680 MHz. That's not a thermal limitation, and it's not aggressive throttling, that's just how the chip is designed. The 8 Gen 2 relies on a wider, more complex GPU operating at lower frequencies, while the G2 Gen 2 takes a more narrow, higher clocked approach. Those are two different design philosophies, and when workloads lean heavily on sustained GPU throughput, that difference in clock targets becomes a meaningful part of the performance story. And you're going to shortly see why the G2 Gen 2 is punching so far above its weight. Meadowfell is a chilled out open world exploration game, but do not let the relaxed vibe fool you. Under the hood is a surprisingly useful benchmark. The game features an unusually granular graphics settings menu, which makes it ideal for stress testing both CPU and GPU behavior across different platforms. For this test though, both devices are running at very high settings, keeping visual parity as close as possible. Starting with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, the game settles at around 24 to 25 frames per second in this scene. GPU frequency is pinned at 680 MHz, which is the maximum operating clock for this platform. CPU clocks sit comfortably in the low to mid 2 GHz range with no signs of saturation. That immediately tells us that this scene is GPU limited, not CPU bound. The processor has the headroom, but the GPU has nowhere left to go. Switching to the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2, the same scene runs at just over 52 frames per second with the GPU operating at 950 MHz. That's a dramatic uplift. Comparing the two directly, the G2 Gen 2 is delivering roughly 113% higher performance in this scene, more than double the frame rate of the 8 Gen 2. This is not the result of CPU advantage either. The CPU clocks here are slightly lower than on the 8 Gen 2, hovering in the mid 2 GHz range, yet performance still scales sharply upwards thanks to the higher frequency GPU. What this shows very clearly is that Meadowfell, at these settings at least, is overwhelmingly GPU bound on both platforms. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 stronger CPU simply doesn't factor into the equation because the GPU reaches its frequency ceiling first. Meanwhile, the G2 Gen 2's GPU has significantly more clock headroom and the game scales almost linearly with it. In this specific scene, the takeaway is straightforward. The Snapdragon G2 Gen 2's higher sustained GPU clock allows it to outperform the 8 Gen 2 by over 100%, despite having the weaker CPU on paper. This is a clean example of how GPU design and frequency targets can matter far more than raw CPU strength in real gaming workloads, and it's a pattern we're going to see repeated in other GPU-heavy tests. Alien Isolation is a really important reality check, and not just because of how it runs, but because of how it doesn't run by default on Android. Out of the box, Alien Isolation is deliberately constrained. Resolution and visual settings are held way back to accommodate the broadest range of phones, and the assumption is always protect thermals first, performance second. To get a fair comparison here, I had to go directly into the game's configuration files and manually force high settings and native 1080p on both platforms. This is the version of the game that Android handhelds should be running, but often aren't because the ecosystem still treats every device like it's a thin phone that might melt if you look at it wrong. With that context set, Alien Isolation behaves very differently from Meadowfell. This is a much more CPU-sensitive game overall, and it's one of the very few native Android titles where the CPU can actually become a meaningful limiter once you remove the software shackles. In the first comparison scene, the corridor setup, we see the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2 at 47.2 FPS with the GPU at 950 MHz, while the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 lands at 55.6 FPS with the GPU at 680 MHz. In this scene, the 8 Gen 2 is ahead by about 17.8%, and what makes this result interesting is why it happens. Even with a much lower GPU clock, the 8 Gen 2 pulls way ahead anyway, which is a strong indication that the bottleneck here is not the GPU. Instead, the game is leaning heavily on the CPU. Simulation, scripting, draw submission, and this is where the 8 Gen 2's stronger CPU design and higher potential clocks start to matter. And the second scene is just more of the same. In this larger room, the G2 Gen 2 sits at 38 FPS while still running the GPU at its max clock, and the 8 Gen 2 comes in at 44.6 FPS with its GPU also maxed out. That's again a lead of roughly 17.4% for the 8 Gen 2, almost the same margin as the first scene, and that consistency is the tell-all. If this were GPU bound, you'd expect that 950 MHz part to start stretching its legs and clawing back performance as pixel and shading workloads increase, but it doesn't. The higher clock GPU is basically waiting around for the rest of the frame to be ready. Meanwhile, the 8 Gen 2 continues to outperform despite the lower GPU clock, which reinforces the same conclusion. Alien Isolation at these four settings is primarily CPU bound in these interior scenes. It's a pretty clean demonstration of CPU behavior. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 can deliver a fairly consistent 17% average in CPU limited scenes, even when the G2 Gen 2 is operating at substantially higher GPU frequency, which to some is not going to be impressive or something they did not already know. Good gaming practice has taught us that it's always better to spec up on the GPU versus the CPU. The question is though, would you make this same decision for an Android handheld? I'm keeping things pretty high level today with the chipset overviews, but if you're a Retroid fan, you know that the RP6 has the 8 Gen 2, which becomes the more compelling buy. Do you go for the 8 Gen 2 or do you go for the G2 Gen 2 in the Retroid Pocket G2? These names are ridiculous. But at any rate, I will tell you which to go for after today's sponsor, which is me. I'm today's sponsor. For those who don't know, I'm also an indie game developer. I make cracked out, unmarketable art, shall we say, usually weird, usually overscoped, and I've been dabbling in Unreal Engine for a few years now. My current project is sort of a Resident Evil inspired dungeon crawler where you scale an ever-shifting structure, fight your way through hostile spaces, and try to escape something that very much does not want you to leave. The working title is currently Occupant of Malice. Ooh. What makes this relevant is that the game has been developed first and foremost for Android handhelds. That means controller first input, sustained performance targets, and aggressive GPU side optimization. Because of that, I found that my own projects actually serve as a pretty solid benchmark for understanding the real limits of these chipsets, especially once you move beyond phone class assumptions. My project is almost entirely GPU bound. There's very little AI overhead, minimal simulation, and no heavy CPU side logic holding things back. What you're about to see here is essentially raw rendering throughput. Starting with the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2, the results are frankly kind of absurd for an Android device. At native 1440p with no upscaling, the game runs at a locked 60 frames per second the vast majority of time. Now, there are occasional dips into the mid-50s during heavier scenes, or if I'm playing around with like dual camera perspectives, but in practice, 1440p 60 is achievable roughly 97% of the time, and again, this is a full Unreal Engine 5 title running natively with no dynamic resolution tricks or reduced shaders. Switching over to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, the picture changes dramatically. At 1440p, the chip simply cannot hold performance reliably. Frame rates hover in the high 20s to low 30s with frequent drops that make a 60 FPS target completely unrealistic. Even backing down to 1080p, the 8 Gen 2 still trails, running closer to the low to mid 40s, while the G2 Gen 2 continues to maintain a clean 60 FPS lock. If we put numbers on it, the gap is staggering. At 1440p, the G2 Gen 2's 60 FPS result compared to the 8 Gen 2's roughly 31 FPS average represents a 93.5% performance advantage. That's not a small lead, that's not variance, that's a class difference in GPU. I mean, you can even tell in supported rendering feature sets. The 8 Gen 2 does not seem to support permanent actor shadows. You can see how the shadows disappear after a few seconds on the Odin 2 Pro. That's not a setting I forgot to turn off or something like that. This is a hardline feature. You get the full shadow suite on the G2 Gen 2 platform. And to prove these results are not some weird edge case with my dungeon crawler, I ran the same kind of test on another UE5 project of mine, a 3D platformer prototype. Right now, it's basically a rendering stress test, a dense, complex city scene with more triangles on screen, more visible objects, and more raw geometry to push. It looks cartoony, but in terms of rendering costs, this is essentially a desktop-style scene on mobile, and I did not scale it back for handhelds. There's no mobile-friendly material pass, no simplified lodge strategy for this run. I wanted the chips to actually bear the full brunt of the workload. At 1440p, and in both captures, you can see we're pushing a full 2560 by 1440 rendering target. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 sits at 35.3 FPS, with the GPU of course maxed out, while the G2 Gen 2 reaches 46 FPS with its GPU also maxed out. That's a lead of about 30.3% for the G2 Gen 2 in a scene that is overwhelmingly GPU bound. Same general visual comparison, same resolution target, but one chip just has more sustained GPU throughput available. Dropping down to 1080p, the gap doesn't disappear, it actually stays remarkably consistent. The 8 Gen 2 comes in at 44.9 FPS, while the G2 Gen 2 is effectively brushing the ceiling at 59.2 FPS. Again, with the GPU clocks both sustained and maxed out, that's roughly a 31.8% advantage for the G2 Gen 2. And what I like about this result is that it tells you the scene isn't suddenly becoming CPU limited at lower resolution. The scaling still favors the part with higher GPU frequency and higher sustained raster throughput. So even in totally different UE5 projects, different content, different structure, different rendering profiles, the story stays the same. If the workload is predominantly GPU bound and you're asking the device to render something closer to a desktop scene, the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2 keeps showing up with a consistent 30% advantage at both 1440p and 1080p. That is not noise, that is a repeatable pattern. It's just better in this regard. When you zoom out from individual scenes and look at results as a whole, a clear pattern emerges, which you probably already know. In workloads that are primarily CPU bound, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 holds a consistent advantage of around 17 to 20% on average. That margin shows up whenever a game leans heavily on simulation, scripting, or draw submission, the kinds of tasks that reward higher peak CPU clocks and stronger single-threaded performance. In GPU-bound workloads, however, the balance shifts decisively. Across GPU-heavy tests, modern engines, higher internal resolutions, and Unreal Engine 5 content, the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2 consistently lands anywhere from 30% faster on average to nearly double performance in most extreme cases. That spread, again, is not noise. It reflects how aggressively the G2 Gen 2 GPU is tuned relative to the 8 Gen 2 itself. The important point to note is that neither chip is misbehaving. In every capture, both are operating at their designated limits. The 8 Gen 2's GPU tops at around 680 MHz and stays there, just like the G2 Gen 2 GPU running all the way up to 950 MHz and sustaining it. Those targets alone don't tell the full story, of course, but they simply explain why GPU-heavy workloads scale so differently between the two. And this difference makes more sense once you remember where these chips came from. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 was designed first as a flagship phone SoC. Its priority was a fast, responsive CPU capable of handling bursty workloads, complex app behavior, and everything a premium smartphone demands. GPU performance is strong, of course, but it's balanced around efficiency and a wider range of use cases. The Snapdragon G2 Gen 2, by contrast, is effectively a refreshed, repurposed platform derived from Qualcomm's mid-tier mobile silicon, but with a retuned GPU and a very different set of assumptions. The CPU is good enough, but the GPU is allowed to run faster and longer because this chip is meant to live in a device that plays games for hours at a time. In the context of which device you should buy, I would recommend the Retroid Pocket G2 over the RP6 every time if you're looking for more native experiences. They are close enough in price, but I don't feel like it's an upgrade to go from the G2 to the 8 Gen 2. The G2 Gen 2 feels like the more forward-thinking platform, even for something like PC game emulation, which is super CPU bound. There will come a point where the CPU side of the workload gets more efficient and things shift over to the GPU itself. You might want to bet on having the faster and better GPU if this is a concern of yours. Just like you might want to bet on me as your authority for all things Android and handheld. I'm not going to hold you guys any longer though. If you've enjoyed this video, please kindly do the YouTube things. Going into a big year next year, you know, lots of events coming up. But without further ado, this is Silicon Fox signing out and saying ciao.